Back in 1997, the world felt different, and the way people consumed stories felt different too. There wasn't a screen in your pocket, there wasn't a non-stop feed telling you what to think every 5 seconds. When something hit the airwaves, it stopped people. It meant something. Television still had weight, authority, and credibility, and when a major interview aired, the whole country leaned in at the same time. You didn't watch it later. You didn't clip it. You were there when it happened or you missed it. That year, America was fascinated with power, notoriety, and larger-than-life personalities. The line between celebrity and infamy had already started to blur. People weren't just curious about crime anymore. They were curious about the people behind it, how they talked, how they justified themselves, how they looked when the cameras were rolling. And the media knew it. They understood that these figures weren't just news subjects, they were cultural events. An interview like that wasn't just journalism, it was theater. It was carefully timed, carefully framed, and carefully sold to the public as something rare, maybe even dangerous. The audience didn't just want facts, they wanted access. They wanted to feel like they were sitting in the room watching history unfold in real time. And the interviewer wasn't just asking questions. She was standing in for the public, walking a tightrope between accountability and intrigue. For me, standing inside that moment, I didn't fully grasp how big it was. When you're living inside history, it doesn't announce itself. It feels normal. It feels like another day where you show up, play a role, and keep moving. But looking back now, I can see how carefully constructed that moment was, how much symbolism it carried, and how much it said about the country at that time. This was an era when image mattered more than context. Sound bites mattered more than consequences. And once someone was framed a certain way on television, that image stuck. The public didn't see court transcripts or long timelines. They saw confidence, charm, defiance, or vulnerability, and they filled in the rest themselves. Media didn't just reflect reality, it shaped it. There was also something else happening in 1997 that's easy to miss now. The media still believed it could control the narrative. Editors decided what you saw. Producers decided what mattered. And when they put something on primetime television, it came with an unspoken message: this is important, and you should pay attention. That kind of authority doesn't exist anymore, but back then, it was absolute. When I think about that interview, now, I don't just think about the questions or the answers. I think about the moment in history that allowed it to happen the way it did. A moment when the country was captivated by power, when television was king, and when stories like this were treated less like cautionary tales and more like cultural landmarks. And that context is everything, because without understanding the world of 1997, you can't understand what really happened when those cameras turned. I didn't step into that moment thinking I was stepping into history. That's the honest truth. At the time, it felt like one of those situations life puts you in without giving you a roadmap. I wasn't chasing the spotlight, and I wasn't trying to be part of some larger narrative. I was there because circumstances, relationships, and timing lined up in a way you don't always see until much later. Back then, you move forward. You don't pause to analyze what it might mean 28 years from now. My connection to the interview wasn't something I planned or engineered. It came from being close to the action, understanding the players, and being trusted to navigate a very specific space. That trust didn't come overnight. It came from reputation, from consistency, from knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. In worlds like that, people watch how you move long before they listen to what you say. At the time, I saw my role as practical. I wasn't thinking about cameras, legacy, or public perception. I was thinking about keeping things smooth, controlled, and predictable in a situation that could easily go sideways. When media steps into a private world, there's always tension. Everyone wants something. The interviewer wants a story. The network wants ratings. The public wants drama. And the people being interviewed want control. My position sat right in the middle of all of that. What's interesting looking back is how normal it all felt then. That's what proximity does. When you're close to power, close to influence, close to moments people later call historic, they lose their shine. They become routine. You don't wake up thinking today will be remembered. You wake up thinking, let's get through this clean. I didn't fully appreciate how unusual it was for someone like me to be part of that process. I didn't see how rare access really was. or how carefully guarded those doors usually stayed. I understood the risks, sure, but I didn't understand the narrative value. I didn't understand how the media would later frame who mattered in that room and who didn't. There's also the personal side of it. Being involved meant carrying weight that didn't belong to the public. It meant understanding loyalties, lines that couldn't be crossed, and consequences that didn't show up on camera. None of that makes good television, but it makes real life very real. And when you're younger, you think you can compartmentalize that? You think you can keep the public moments separate from the private reality? Time teaches you otherwise. Now, when I revisit that period, I see how much I underestimated my own position in the story. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I didn't realize how being there, seeing it up close and understanding what wasn't shown, would eventually matter more than what was broadcast. My involvement wasn't about fame. It was about perspective. And perspective is the one thing you don't realize you're gaining until years later, when you finally step back and see the full picture. When you're in the room with someone like Diane Sawyer, you quickly realize this isn't just another interview. There's a precision to her, a control that you can feel even before the cameras start rolling. She doesn't just ask questions, she orchestrates the conversation. She's aware of every nuance, the timing, the tone, the way a pause can carry more weight than a sentence. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate it. I just knew that being on the other side of that presence demanded you bring your own game, because she's bringing hers without question. She has this way of balancing authority and curiosity, of keeping you off balance just enough so you reveal more than you realize. And it isn't about trickery, it's about skill, about experience, about knowing what the public wants and guiding the conversation in a way that delivers it. You can't bluff someone like that. You can't hide behind a rehearsed story. You're either present, fully engaged, or you're exposed. Watching her work made it clear why she was one of the best. She's not just asking questions, she's holding a mirror up to the person across from her and letting the audience see what they need to see. What struck me most was her ability to navigate tension. Here's someone sitting across from a person with a reputation for being untouchable in certain circles. Someone the world had a million different opinions about. And yet she didn't flinch. She asked the questions that mattered, stayed composed under pressure, and never let the moment get away from her. It was a masterclass in presence. And in that room, with all the cameras, lights, and silent expectations, presence mattered more than anything else. I also remember how much thought she put into framing the story for the audience. This wasn't about shouting or dramatics. It was about clarity, precision, and impact. Every question, every follow-up, every look into the camera was calculated to give the public insight without tipping into spectacle. And that's where you see the difference between someone who does interviews for a living and someone who does them because they need to. Sawyer was in complete command, and the audience could feel it even if they didn't consciously recognize it. Being part of that dynamic, even peripherally, teaches you something about storytelling and influence. See, the interview is a performance, yes, but it's a disciplined performance, and discipline in storytelling creates trust. People believe what they see, not because it's easy to believe, but because the structure, the control, the thoughtfulness behind it feels real, and that's rare, very rare. Looking back now, decades later, I can see how her approach shaped not just the story, but the perception of everyone involved. She didn't just ask questions, she controlled the narrative without ever appearing to do so. That's why revisiting this interview after all these years is so revealing. It's not just about what was said, it's about how it was said, who was present, and the skill that made the audience believe they were seeing everything, even when so much was carefully curated. And that's the power of a true professional in her craft. When you step back and think about John Gotti, the first thing most people picture is the persona, the hair, the charisma, the confidence that seemed larger than life. On television, in newspapers, in conversations around the country, he was more than a man, he was a symbol. He represented power, defiance, and the kind of danger that fascinates people from a distance. But standing there in the room, seeing him up close, you realize there's a difference between the public image and the reality of the person behind it. On camera, Gotti was calculated. Every gesture, every word, every glance had weight. It's easy to assume that someone who projects that kind of presence is unshakable, But reality is always more complicated. There's a human side behind the bravado, decisions made in real time, and pressures that don't translate to television. Being there, you notice the subtle things. The way he reacts when a question lands differently than he expected. The pauses that reveal thought processes. The effort it takes to maintain that image under. People often forget that the image we see in the media is sculpted, intentionally or not. For someone like Gotti, the media didn't just report him, they amplified him. His legend was built as much on what was shown as what wasn't. The confidence, the charm, the defiance, all of it was framed in a way that left the public in awe, sometimes even admiration, even as the realities of his life told a more complex story. That contrast between perception and reality is one of the most fascinating things about revisiting that interview years later. You realize how much of the persona was performance, consciously or unconsciously curated, and how much was just survival in an environment where appearances could mean everything. Being there also showed me that Gotti understood the power of the camera better than most. He knew how to present himself in ways that would stick with viewers. He knew that an image, once broadcast, could become permanent in the public imagination. And he used that understanding to his advantage, shaping the narrative of who he was, even when he couldn't control all the details of his story. It wasn't just about confidence, it was strategy, and it was practice. But the reality behind that strategy was more nuanced. There were moments of tension, moments of calculation, and moments where the person beneath the persona became visible. Those moments are subtle, easy to miss if you're only watching on a screen, but they tell the real story. The public sees power and mystique. The people in the room see the human decisions, the complexities, and the contradictions. That's the difference between legend and reality, and that difference is what makes revisiting this interview so compelling decades later. Understanding that contrast helps explain why people were captivated then, and why the story continues to resonate now. It wasn't just about crime or notoriety. It was about a figure who commanded attention, managed perception, and navigated an intense public gaze while being fully human beneath it. And that's why revisiting the interview doesn't just show what was said. It shows the tension between image and truth. At the time of that interview, I didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening, and I think that's true for anyone who's in the middle of a historic moment. When you're younger or less experienced, you see things through a lens of immediacy. You see the questions, the answers, the cameras, the people, but you don't always see the layers beneath. You don't see how the public will consume it, how the media will shape it, or how history will remember it. You just experience it. There were so many things I took for granted back then. I assumed that everyone understood the context, that people would automatically see the nuance, and that the power of what was unfolding would be obvious. But perspective is something you only gain over time. When you're in the middle of a story like that, you focus on what's in front of you. The logistics, the personalities, the immediate risks. You don't stop to think about the long-term impact because the long-term doesn't exist yet. Looking back now, I realize how much I missed. I didn't fully grasp how extraordinary it was to be part of that room, to witness the way someone like John Gotti interacted with the media, or to see how someone like Diane Sawyer commanded the space with such precision. At the time, it seemed normal, just another day doing a job, managing a situation. But it wasn't normal. It was rare. And I didn't recognize it. I also didn't fully understand the responsibility that came with being involved. There's a delicate balance when you're part of a story that the world is watching. Your actions, your choices, and even your presence can affect how the narrative unfolds. When you're younger, it's easy to underestimate that responsibility. You think, I'm just here. I'm just doing my part. But the truth is, everyone in that room plays a role in shaping perception, whether they realize it or not. And there's another layer I didn't see clearly then, the way people interpret what they see on television. Back in 1997, the public didn't have the endless access to context that we have today. People weren't digging into social media threads or watching hours of raw footage. They saw what was broadcast, and they formed opinions that could stick for a lifetime. I didn't fully understand how much of an influence that interview would have on people's perceptions, not just of John Gotti, but of everyone involved. Now, decades later, revisiting the experience gives me a completely different perspective. I see the subtleties I missed, the power dynamics I underestimated, and the ways in which the story was framed for public consumption. I see how my own understanding at the time was limited, shaped by proximity and by experience, and how that limited understanding influenced the way I moved in that room. The truth is, you don't realize the full significance of a moment until you step back years later and view it through the lens of history. And that's why revisiting this interview now matters so much. It's not just about what happened, but about what I didn't fully see at the time. Revisiting that interview 28 years later isn't just an exercise in nostalgia. It's about understanding how much has changed, both in the world around us and in the way I see those moments. Time has a way of sharpening perspective. What once seemed ordinary, routine, or even mundane takes on new significance when you step back and look at it with the benefit of hindsight. You start to notice the small details, the choices that seemed minor at the time, but ended up shaping the entire story. The media landscape itself has transformed completely since 1997. Back then, television was king. When an interview aired, it had a kind of authority, a sense of finality. People didn't just scroll past it or tweet about it. They absorbed it, talked about it at dinner tables, debated it in real time. Now everything is instant, fragmented, and fleeting. Revisiting the interview now allows me to see the difference between those two worlds, to understand how the public consumed information then and how that shaped their perception of the people involved. It's also about revisiting my own experience, my own role in the story. When you're in the room, you don't always realize the impact your presence has, the subtle ways you influence the flow of events. Over time, you start to understand that being there wasn't just about logistics or getting through the day. It was about perspective, about seeing the machinery of media and personality at work and understanding how it all intersects. What seemed routine then now feels like a rare opportunity to witness history from the inside. There's something else that becomes clear only with time, the layers of storytelling. The interview wasn't just about questions and answers. It was about perception, about control, about what was shown and what wasn't. Looking back, I see how carefully every element was orchestrated, how every glance, pause, and phrasing contributed to the narrative that the public ultimately received. That awareness changes the way you remember the experience. It's no longer just a personal memory. It becomes a lens through which to analyze culture, media, and power. Revisiting the interview also allows me to reflect on growth, both personal and professional. I can see the things I didn't understand at the time, the assumptions I carried, and the nuances I missed. I can appreciate the skill of those around me in a way I couldn't before. And that reflection gives the story a new life, a new dimension, and a new relevance for the present day. Most importantly, looking back underscores why certain stories endure. It's not just about the person being interviewed or the questions being asked. It's about the moment, the context, and the way human nature interacts with power and media. That's what makes revisiting this interview not just interesting, but essential. And that's why, 28 years later, this story still matters.